welcome to the third installment of the Better Conversation speaker series, To Be or Not to Be, Artists in and Arts Administration. I'm Erica Pedersen. I'm a research scientist at Arts Business Collaborative, or ABC for short. And for those of you joining us for the first time, ABC is a technical assistance and research organization working to facilitate access to capital, networks, and training for BIPOC artists, arts organizations, and small businesses. And the Rising Tides Research Institute is the action-oriented research department of ABC, where we perform internal evaluations and develop independent projects that result in meaningful and accessible data for our constituency. Our evolving portfolio of projects responds to enduring systems of inequality that adversely impact people of color, especially within the arts and culture sector. The A Better Conversation speaker series is an extension of our COVID-19 and the creative economy study, which examines conditions faced by BIPOC artists and arts businesses prior to and since COVID in order to cultivate collaborative strategies for sustainability and success. And so today, without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce two of our study participants, Maxine Montilus, who's the founding artistic director of MV Dance. Thank you for joining us, Maxine. And Shayna Schlosberg, who's the director of strategy and operations at Women of Color in the Arts, also known as WOCA. Thank you, Shayna, as well. And so let's get started by having each of you tell us a little more about yourselves and your work. And to help orient the conversation a little bit, let us know if you identify as an artist, an arts administrator, both, or if you're not really sure how to situate yourself within those terms. And so how about Maxine, you get us started?
I identify as a dance artist primarily. And for me, I say dance artist because I feel like it encompasses all that I do as a performer, choreographer, educator, scholar. And in terms of my administration, I went from having a full-time career as an arts administrator and dancing and choreographing on the side to making teaching my primary thing. And really my administration skills have applied to be managing myself in my project-based company. And so I did my undergraduate degree in dance at University of the Arts in Philadelphia. I'm originally from Brooklyn, born and raised, and still here, and did, pre-professional training in dance in Harlem at the Boys Harbor Conservatory before going to University of the Arts, where I was a modern performance major. Right after undergrad, I did my master's in arts management at City University London, and which now has a new name. I think it's cultural management. It's a fancier name, but the courses are still the same, essentially. And I first did arts administration in high school. My high school, which was Midwood High School in Brooklyn, they had an executive internship program, and I was placed at the 92nd Street White Harkness Dance Center to assist in their offices, and coordinating their programs. And I was inspired to go into arts administration by the woman I identify as my dance mom, Nina Clivert Lawson, who now runs her own. She used to run the dance division at Boys Harbor Conservatory and now runs her own school, Project Performing Arts. And seeing her run things in her office as well as teach and everything made me realize I wanted to work in a similar fashion. So, and then when I was at University of the Arts, I did a summer internship at Wolf Trap Performing Arts Center, which still exists. And I also want to highlight that they have an African-American development program where if you identify as African-American, they provide free housing when I did it, it was free housing at American University. I don't know what the terms are now. And a paid stipend and transportation to and from Wolf Trap. And I know they've started a similar program for Latinos. So I just wanted to highlight that program. And then I did an internship with my dance pedagogy teacher at UArts, also ran the Philadelphia Arts and Education Partnership, and I was able to work for her my senior year. So I was cultivating my interest in arts administration alongside my training as a performer and choreographer. And I chose to go to Sydney University because, I was dying to experience life abroad while pursuing my interest in arts administration. And it was a rich experience because it gave me a chance to look at international cultural policies that way different countries approach arts administration and arts policies. And I had people, my school was very international. London is a very international city. So it was a rich experience. And when I came back, I basically jump-started my arts administration career. I worked at the Juilliard School for nearly 4 years. And then I worked in smaller organizations after that. Like one was a teaching artist organization, Marquee Studios. And then I worked for a dance organization in Brooklyn as a director of education. And as I mentioned before this call began, I had an unceremonious departure from that particular dance organization where I kind of butted heads with the head of the division. I don't know if we're going to get into all the isms involved in working in arts administration as a Black woman. I'm not going to lie, because I had rich experiences, but some of the challenges that I faced, particularly in the smaller organizations, were, if I offered an opinion that went against a superior's, then I was seen as combative. I couldn't, had to be careful my tone in addressing concerns or whatever, because, there's the angry Black woman trope. And I felt like a lot of that came into play really with that last organization I worked with, which is why I didn't name it. And because the ones I did name, I had more positive experiences. And so I was let go for issues around that sort of thing. And I eventually kind of hit a wall where, I reached middle management. And when I tried to go for more senior positions, I was told, I don't have enough experience or whatever, which was insane, because at that point I had worked in arts management for 7-8 years. And, I was already having inklings of switching over to teaching. And so when I saw that I was hitting this wall and had this fatigue around work in arts administration, I decided, let me use this time now to make that transition. So I transitioned to teaching in after-school programs. And from there, I went into a program where that no longer exists, unfortunately, where I was essentially given scholarship money to get certification to teach dance in public schools, which included completing another graduate degree at Hunter College. And I transitioned to teaching full-time in public school system for 3 years. Unfortunately, that also proved to be a toxic experience. So I transitioned now to teaching in higher ed, which has been far more positive and amazing. Mm-hmm. I also am still a teaching artist for Camille A. Brown and dancers. So I'm very fulfilled with my work as an educator. My administration skills, I feel, have parlayed into, like I said, managing myself as an independent contractor and my project-based dance company, MV Dance Project, which I started in 2019. So I don't consider my work in administration as a loss. I gained so much from it. And it's interesting. I had dinner last night with one of my former supervisors at the Juilliard School. And as we were walking down the block at Juilliard, she goes, "Oh, do you have issues around walking down the block at Juilliard?" I said, "No, why?" She told me that there were past coworkers that I guess were scarred by their experiences there, and they didn't even like to walk near the school. Wow. I said, I know. I said, I have no.
I get it.
And I said, I'm the complete opposite. I look back at my time at Juilliard fondly. Don't get me wrong, there were issues, stuff that came up, but I look back at that time fondly, and I said, I gained so much working here. Mm. And I still have friendships and connections to that school that have supported me in my career and have very rich connections to this day. And I said, I look back at this time quite fondly. So I gained so many skills in terms of how to present myself and how to manage myself and manage others and collaborate with different entities. That was like a great starting point to my administration career. So I have no regrets, especially since those skills still help me as an educator and performer and choreographer. But I'll stop now because I want to give Shayna a chance to speak.
Thank you, Maxine, for sharing. Yeah, Shayna, go ahead and let us know.
Sure. No, it's a great story, Maxine. So thank you for sharing. And yeah, there are so many moments throughout what you were sharing. I was like, yep. So no, there's a lot of points of intersection and also some differences. But I primarily identify as an arts administrator, but also as an arts advocate and an artist, like an advocate for artists in Houston specifically, which is a very challenging city to be an artist. So I include that just to sort of lift up a lot of the organizing I do in the Houston community with artists specifically, though professionally, I primarily identify as an arts administrator. And my path to this work started when I was actually a child. My mother is a dancer. And so I grew up seeing her be a kindergarten teacher by day and a flamenco and folklorico dancer by night, which sounds a little salacious. It was not. But so I always, I grew up seeing her sort of juggle those two worlds, and the arts was just a huge part of my upbringing. And I went to the high school for the performing arts in Houston. I was in the drama department. It's a very serious school. The training is almost conservatory-like, and I continued in that conservatory environment at New York University. I got my BFA in drama there. So after 8 intensive years in the conservatory world, I was feeling a little bit burnt out. And as a woman of color, I was really questioning my value and my worth and where I saw myself in the theater world. It's a really it at the time was challenging to be in conservatory and be a woman of color. The pieces that you're, told you can select from, the monologues, the aesthetics, the work that's considered worth doing, it really is very confusing. And so at the end of it, I just thought, okay, I don't feel good, so I need to take a break, and decided to pursue an area of my life that I sort of had neglected throughout those 8 years, which was sort of an intercultural exchange. So it's interesting, Maxine, that you kind of bring that up. We share that in our path. And I joined the Peace Corps. I took a hard left and joined the Peace Corps. And I was in Armenia and teaching English. And I also taught theater classes while I was there, sort of as extracurricular after school classes. And that experience really did make me realize that I need to be in the arts. That's the world that I want to return to, but not as a performer. So I started to look into ways that I could stay in that world, because unlike Maxine, I was not aware of arts administration as a career, strangely. But I think a lot of people experience that. I just did not know it existed, what it was. The arts to me was being an artist. And I was, just kind of doing some research and realized, okay, there's this field of arts administration. And I found a new master's program that had an international focus. So I got my master's in international arts management from a program that's a joint degree between Southern Methodist University and HEC Montreal. So I was going around, I did half of my training in the US and then half of that in Canada. And it was very interesting. Also gained a sort of perspective on just how different, really countries outside of the US operate. And how unique our approach to the nonprofit arts world is. And so after that experience, I was hired as the associate general manager at the Alley Theater, which is a big regional theater here in Houston. It's a $14 million organization. It was a big job to get right out of grad school. And a big asset that I was told that I brought was my passion and dedication and interest in expanding programming that reflects Latinx, Latine communities. It had been just neglected in Houston for so long. But in that position, I found myself experiencing what a lot of people of color experience in those environments. And I was doing 3 jobs at once. I was, a cultural consultant in addition to being a full-time associate general manager. And it was pretty exhausting. And after about 4 years there, I shifted and went to a smaller operation called the Catastrophic Theater. I was the managing director there. I had more autonomy, more decision-making power. And really, I just had a real seat at the table. Whereas before, I felt like I was valued sometimes, but not when I was really challenging and pushing and fighting for, real say in the organization. And so I wanted to have the opportunity to do that. So I pursued a larger role in a smaller organization, and I was there for about 3 years. And it was I did really feel the impact of my presence there. as an arts administrator, woman of color. But I was still operating, within the usual. As this was happening, my passion for growing leadership in our field and specifically serving women of color grew, and I realized I needed to make yet another shift, and really try to make my full-time work serving those that are like me, who keep hitting this ceiling, Maxine, that you mentioned, and really just dedicating my time to an organization that in its DNA is all about that. It's hard to find organizations like that. So I feel very blessed and very lucky to have landed with Boca. So that's me.
Awesome. Thank you so much for sharing all that. And so to keep the conversation going and to kind of, start really a conversation between the two of you. We want to keep it loose and open to improvisation. We're going to leave some time at the end for Q&A. So anyone who's attending, if you have questions, please submit them in the Q&A section. There's an icon at the bottom that says Q&A, and you can submit them there, and we'll make sure to get to them before the end of the hour. But I'll go ahead and kick things off with a question so that you can respond directly to it or use it as a jumping off point to ask each other questions. And to be honest, both of you have touched upon answers to this, but we can use this as a way to kind of dig in. How do artists find themselves in arts administration, and what keeps them there or drives them away? So again, the both of you have shared a little bit on that, but does anyone want to start expanding and taking it from there?
Well, like I said before, watching my dance mom be such an effective, wonderful director in the program that I studied under with her inspired me to want to go into that realm. And it seemed to be great to gain experience in how how things happen behind the scenes. And like I said, I find that even now it's still beneficial information for me. Like even as a teaching artist, when I'm asked for certain things for grants and what have you, I get it. Like I understand the language that goes behind certain things. And I find that the organizations I engage with are very appreciative of me having that understanding. So, of course, and I'm not going to lie, there's some artists I know who go into it for the stability of it, because let's face it, being a freelancer, the struggle is that you don't necessarily always have reliable income. I was even just sharing recently in a focus group for an artistic project that the catch-22 is that when I was a full-time arts administrator, I only could take dance classes in the evenings and weekends because during the day I'm at work. And then once I had more of a flexible schedule as an educator, my salary wasn't as high as before. So then, I had to pick and choose when I take class. So there's that struggle in terms of how to maintain your practice. And in terms of what causes people to leave, I mean, I find that the narrative, like when I come across people who leave arts administration, the narrative is very different for people of color versus Caucasians. I'm just gonna, it's just the reality. Like I've met quite a few people of color who have similar stories to mine, where you're kind of driven out for, being, seeming combative, or, I just remember the dance I always had to do in terms of how I had to present myself in certain settings, and the bias is there. Like I remember there were organizations where when I worked for them, and when you step outside, you're the face of the organization. When I showed up, people were shocked that this voice that they had spoken to on the phone was a Black woman. So like they didn't hide their shock well when I showed up. Like I said, I remember times having to watch my tone or like manage how I offered ideas for whoever I was speaking to be receptive to it, because I would then be seen as combative or difficult. And those are words that often chase Black women in these spaces, especially predominantly white organizations. So, and like I said, the last administration experience I had, that was definitely an issue. And, anytime I offered a perspective that was different from my superior, it was, I can't work with Maxine, this is not, she would tell coworkers behind my back who fortunately would inform me. They were like, she was like, I don't think this is going to work. But then like, if she was moody in the sense that when I did go along with certain things, it's, I think this is going to work. But then the minute I showed an opposing opinion, I don't know if we can, this is Maxine's, we can keep Maxine here. And in the end, she like took me out to lunch one day and was like, I don't think this is going to work. After I had been there for a little over a year. Wow. And like I said, like when I started looking for, and I also come across other Black women, particularly that hit this wall that I hit. Like it's hard to ascend past middle management. And so people who still want to work in arts administration, I find that they start their own projects or own initiatives, or they transition out altogether. And I know some Black women who've had like worse experiences than me in terms of the resistance within organizations, to the point where some have had to get legal support.
Oh yeah.
And so, that's the narrative that I find through a lot of people of color, particularly other Black women who've gone into arts administration versus not.
And it's, as a, biracial Latina, I've similar experiences have pushed me and colleagues of similar identities, not away from arts administration, but as you said, Maxine, into either organizations like WOCA, which are so few and need to be far more supported than they are, or they go and start their own thing because it is a really toxic and damaging space, oftentimes. And it's so, and then just to kind of touch on what, how artists find themselves in those situations. I've also observed what Maxine mentioned, the stability is definitely, something that draws artists to it. I've also observed artists kind of forced into arts administration out of necessity, in these really and I'm speaking mostly about in predominantly white institutions. I've seen in theater anyways, playwrights, who finally break in, and a predominantly white theater with resources invests in them. And the organization's like, well, we don't know how to reach, this is material we're not familiar with. We don't know how to reach people and get people to come to this. This is new. So you, playwright, you need to make sure this is successful. And so you have these playwrights busting their butts, marketing their own show, figuring out outreach. And it's like, what? the investment and support these new underrepresented artists get versus the established known entities is very different. And I've just seen a lot of my artist friends and artists I love doing all the jobs, right, to make sure that they don't fail because they were given a chance. And now they have to make sure it works in an organization that doesn't have a history of supporting that kind of work and reaching the people who need that work. And so it's not necessarily a professional shift that they make, but they're doing a lot of arts administration because they feel like they have to.
I wanted to add that I was also a member of WOCA for much of my time as an arts administrator and got wonderful guidance and support, especially through their mentorship program. I just wanted to raise them up further because their organization is so needed.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I guess I can throw in another question that I think is really important and that the both of you might have interesting and provocative answers to. So I'm wondering, especially hearing how the arts administration space fails so many people of color and artists of color, what are some ways that artists can shape arts administration for the better, to better support their own needs and the needs of their communities, both within and without the arts administration space? And, especially because the two of you situate yourselves both in Shayna's case within and Maxine's case without. So curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I think WOCA is engaged in the work of, so much of the work WOCA does is values-based, it's driven by some very clear values, and we're sort of setting out to shift the industry and shift the culture through these values. And so when someone partners with us, we bring the sort of way of viewing the world with us. And that includes values like self-determination and the belief that the communities that you intend to reach should be at the table and making decisions. We also believe in transparency, and that includes being transparent about salaries. A lot of inequities happen in who gets paid and what they get paid and who gets certain contracts. And that is controlled because of a lack of transparency. And so we just recently launched a job board because WOCA is constantly contacted by not job seekers, but employers to promote their positions. And in order to work with us, you have, the posting has to meet certain guidelines, and included in that is transparency. So it's really just a matter of finding ways to, much like in the political arena, to enact policies that are going to help support these values, infuse your organizations with these values of equity and justice. And so, yeah, we're in the work of culture shift, and that's kind of our approach.
So. Again, wanting to hold up organizations like Women of Color in the Arts, which is what WOCA, of course, stands for, only because it's initially when you posed that question, I was like, that's kind of hard to answer, in the sense that it really depends on the openness of the organization as to how much change they want to implement. And I have been a witness to some organizations not implementing change unless an artist makes serious noise. Like that happened during the quarantine, where an artist published a letter that she had written to an organization that she felt a lack of support with. And that it ended up on medium.com and got circulated like crazy. And that noise is what led the organization that she was talking about to respond to the issues that had arisen. That actually happened a couple of times over quarantine, where certain organizations were called out publicly after the artist tried to engage with them one-on-one. And unfortunately, it has to sometimes come to making that kind of noise. And whereas there are organizations I have witnessed that are open to hearing feedback from artists in terms of what they need and how to be a support. So it really depends on the organization, whether or not it could be as simple as a sit-down conversation and crafting space for artists to be heard, or having an artist call you out publicly and shame you to get you to see what's wrong.
Yeah, it is definitely an interesting moment. That you kind of are bringing up, Maxine, just about the power of what we can do in social media to shift the way that, or to move organizations that have been immovable for so long. I'm also thinking about, we see White American Theater, which is a movement that was born on social media, and there have been some complications. It hasn't been perfect. I don't know all the details, but they did get some pretty, reluctant theaters to finally respond, to issue real action plans that they were going to pursue in order to make their organizations more equitable. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting tool that's being utilized right now. It's it's a shame that it has to come to that, though, this like shaming and very public confrontation. But it's hard to convince folks to give up power. So
I guess I can ask a follow-up question. Do artists tend to gain more power by entering the arts administration space, or does it ultimately become a more disempowering experience, particularly for women of color artists?
Again, it depends. I just feel like it depends on the organization. And I'm not going to lie, my perspective on some organizations is not, I hesitate to have high hopes. I hate to say it, but it's true. Like, for example, last summer, of course, there were a slew of statements of solidarity by all these arts organizations that were flooding my inbox. And I feel like now it's gone back to business as usual because Black Lives Matter isn't trending anymore. And I remember at that time, people were telling me I was being too cynical, but I was actually getting irritated at all the solidarity statements. I was like, since when? Now when it's become this international thing, you want to say something. But, and there were some organizations I'm like, we've been saying stuff for years and you've ignored us. And, now we're really seeing which organizations are committed and what changes they've implemented. Because some organizations have implemented some change since last summer. And then others, I feel like, have gone back to business as usual now that we don't have people piling in the streets screaming for justice. So I do think that artists have power in the sense that, like I said, when you have those public call outs and public shaming, that does lend itself to showing some power that artists have because the organization is, then doesn't want to have a bad image and is forced to respond. But it's a shame that has to come to that. But I find that when stuff like that happens is when it usually has to take a large action like that, unfortunately. But also the positive in artists, for lack of a better word, infiltrating organizations is that that's when change can happen. So that's why, it depends on the organization because the leadership will certainly change things. So, and I've experienced it myself as an administrator when there was like a shift in my supervisors or bosses, and I felt the difference depending on what their commitments were as individuals.
Yeah, it is. I completely agree with what Maxine is saying. It depends on the organization. It depends on the position that the artist is stepping into, because it is difficult to feel empowered in a middle management position when everything else above you is not really seeing you, is not really reflective, can't really support you, just can't. And so it's really, kind of related to what WOCA is in the business of doing, which is, advocating for women of color in those decision-making roles, in those roles where they feel like they have some real power. And then the mission has actually moved beyond just getting them there, because now we're in a place where they're there and trying to do the work that they were hired to do, but still not being supported by the board, by the rest of the organization. And so we're now shifting and expanding to figure out how do we not just get our members there, get artists who, are going after that artistic director position there, but how do we support them and make sure they can stay or support them in transitioning away without internalizing that experience. So
I unmuted myself because you brought up something that I wanted to address, which is that there's not enough conversation about boards.
Yeah.
Because there are times where people of color are put in leadership positions to affect change. But if the board don't like you or what you're trying to do, it's not going to go anywhere. And I've seen stories throughout the years of people of color who are like the first Black or first Asian in a particular role, and then they leave after like 6 months.
Yep.
And that's not an accident because they realize they're having real resistance at a significant level, because a lot of these not all organizations, obviously, because the smaller ones, not necessarily, but there's a lot. I think of like the prestigious arts organizations. They have powerful boards with like old money or, generations of wealth. And you're only going to get so much. And I say old money only because I remember I once briefly worked at a visual arts organization. And that was unfortunately another situation that was contentious. But I remember one of the board members, I got to see who the board was. And that's when I started to notice that their name appeared in a lot of art spaces. And I realized, this family is powerful, because now that I know who the board is and I'm seeing these names, like over the years, I kept seeing their names pop up, certain, like when they would donate money, that these particular centers were renamed after that particular family. And I was like, oh snap. Like I didn't fully understand how powerful they were until after I left. And that's still, that trend still exists. And so it's interesting. You'll hear people of color stepping down from roles after a certain amount of months even, and they get criticized, but no one's stopping to notice the power dynamics in terms of how much change they were able to affect. And it usually largely depends on the board. And people talk about diversifying boards all the time. I think that I've only seen it happen on certain like small mid-level organizations, sure. But like, I'm going to name it a large institution just for examples, like a Lincoln Center. That can be hard to infiltrate and diverse because that's a well-established, prestigious institution with people with significant buying power on their boards. So I was like, I have nothing to lose naming of an organization. So, but it's just people don't pay enough attention to that. And that can really make or break, depending on the size of the organization, that can make or break how long a person stays in a position of influence at an organization.
Yeah. And it's, the boards could be an interesting space for artists to think about entering because, we don't talk enough about the power of the board. I think now there is more conversation about the need to have boards that include, or just really looking at the different ways that we value what a board member can bring beyond just money. Because so much of it is driven by, can they write a big check? And that's just not, that doesn't result in the strongest board. We need boards that have that. It's a necessary part of being a nonprofit, unfortunately, but we also need representation of folks that have all different kinds of skills and benefit and value. And that can be relationships in the community, just a perspective that is missing in the organization. And I think it's really wonderful when organizations have and make a concerted effort to have artists on the board, because the board holds a lot of power. And it's a strange situation because they both hold a lot of power and yet are very removed from the day-to-day. And so that's also kind of a strange dynamic. But the more people we can get on boards who reflect our values and the vision that we're trying to pursue, the easier time we'll have with, the easier time women who are, assuming those roles will have. So, yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, thank you so much for bringing up the board, Maxine, because you're right, that doesn't get talked about a lot in regard to arts organizations and diversifying and better serving communities of color. And so, we're nearing the end of the conversation. So I just wanted to encourage any attendees to drop a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen if you have any questions. And but before we officially started the discussion, I was asking if attendees wanted to just kind of mention in the chat whether they identify as an artist, an arts administrator, both, none of the above, or if you have a hard time kind of situating yourself within those terms. So that'll be kind of interesting for all of us to see. And then, to follow that up, I would like to hear from both of you, especially because each of you kind of veer much more on one side than the other in terms of arts administration and being an artist, although you are both of both worlds ultimately. Do you think it's possible to really be both effectively, or are you always doing one more than the other? Does one infringe on the other? I'm seeing a lot of both, by the way. So I think
it's all good. That's great. That's not my experience, but I've seen many, many people, and it's a challenging thing to do for sure. Having attempted to do it and having seen a lot of people attempt to do it, but it certainly is possible. I've seen a lot of people in the theater world able to be both producers and practitioners. I think it takes real commitment to your practice and focus because it's so easy for that to go on the back burner. So that's what I'll say.
I mean, I lived it. When I was a full-time arts administrator, I look back and I'm like, I even sometimes ask myself, how did I do it? I was a full-time arts administrator and dancing in 3 companies at one point. And I did that for a good 4 or 5 years before transitioning to teaching. And I remember I used to have rehearsals like after 5 o'clock, I'd go to rehearsal, get to grab something to eat real quick, then be ready for rehearsal starting at 7 to 9 or 7 to 8:30, like 4 nights a week. And then my Sundays, I remember I practically lived at Brooklyn Arts Exchange because one company would rehearse from 11 to 1. Then I had time for lunch, and then I rehearsed in the evening from like 5 to 7 or something. And so, and, performances, occasionally I'd take a day off to go perform somewhere. I remember one organization I took a week off. That's why I remember the time I never used my personal time for I didn't do mental health days. My personal days off were committed to because I was like, if I have a gig, I need to use that day off for when I have a gig in the day or something. Or there was one organization that was occasionally agreeable to me going to a couple of daytime rehearsals that had to be scheduled due to scheduling issues. And actually the dance organization that I last worked at, we had an adjacent dance studio, and there was one choreographer that wanted to use the space during the day, and my boss at the time let me jump in the rehearsal for 2 hours in the middle of the workday, as long as I agreed to stay an extra 2 hours. So it was like a constant dance that I had to do. Dance. But, it was a constant, juggling. Obviously, there were times when my personal life was compromised. Like I was telling the story before the Zoom began that my 30th birthday, all my friends thought I was going to do some high wheeling thing to ring in 30. And all I wanted was to have a potluck to see my friends, because I had gone months without seeing many friends because of rehearsals and performances. So I was like, I just want you guys to come over and eat with me. So I made it happen. So it all depends on the individual in terms of how far you want to go with that.
For sure. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm wondering if either of you have a burning question for each other. Our attendees are being a little shy. There's still some time to ask a question if you'd like, but in the meantime, maybe each of you could ask each other a question.
Maxine, would you ever consider returning to arts administration? Is there any, and what would need to change if so?
Well, it's funny you asked that, because I didn't get it, but I just applied for a interim program director / assistant professor position at a university. And I made it down to the final round, and it went to someone else. So I was the first, and I was surprised myself. That was my first time considering an administrative role of any kind in years.
Okay. Yeah.
But it was because it coupled teaching. So I knew I wasn't going to just sit in office 5 days. So it has to be something that allows flexibility. But honestly, with the exception of that role, the only administration I foresee is growing MV Dance Project.
Okay.
As of now.
There's a lot of administration involved in that. So.
Yeah. So obviously we're kind of on pause right now because I'm trying to figure out what things will look like in a pandemic world. But when I had my first company concert, I did the scheduling of rehearsals and constant communication with the dancers, booking the space, because I had a residency at a particular venue. So booking the space on certain nights of the week, going to the printer to print the flyers, communicating with the designer of the flyer and saying yay or nay and sending the images I needed for it, sending the information to go on programs. I did the fundraising, ran the, what was it? Now I'm forgetting which platform I used to fundraise. It was one of those online platforms that to raise money, booking the photographer and the videographer, all of that was.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, in some ways, it kind of seems
you haven't left it. Yeah.
Exactly. And I think, a lot of artists who maybe don't consider themselves arts administrators in a traditional sense ultimately function in the same way.
Yeah,
right.
Sure.
Yeah. So Maxine, a question for Shayna?
Well, before we started chatting, you mentioned like wanting, you're missing an artistic outlet. So what do you think is calling to you at this time in terms of wanting to fulfill that for yourself?
Oh, yeah, I think because I operate in the professional arts space, there's sometimes, I don't know, this pressure for whatever I would do to have a certain level of proficiency or be like good at it. And I think I really just need to let that go and acknowledge that it can look like something else, even if it's not a professional pursuit. And so I'm hoping I can really finally make some time to explore what that could be, because it was such a big part of my adolescence and my younger life, and so I'm hoping to really make space for that again somehow. So we'll see. But I also just love supporting artists. I think because that is where I started. That's the place I came from. That's who I just really care and identify with. It, in some ways, that's like kind of another art form in of itself, like being an advocate and being a real sensitive and aligned advocate. I think there's a space for that and a need for that too. So just kind of, I don't know, leaning into that and using that as a way of, keeping in touch with my inner artist. So.
Thank you for that. That's very honest and real. I guess to add on to what I was saying before, I think part of the reason why I have the mindset I do now is because my priorities have shifted, like really growing as an artist. Like I remember, I'm obviously applying for full-time professor positions. I'm currently an adjunct at 2 different institutions. And one of my friends forwarded me an administrative job. And first it was an arts venue that books the artists. And I remember the first thing that came to my head, she didn't know my priorities, but I do. And I know she was only thinking in terms of Maxine's looking for work. But right. I saw the job posting and I was like, I want to be the artist booked at the venue. I don't want to be the one the artist there. I want to be the artist going there. Like I was like, no. That helped me be very clear on how to move forward. Like there's some opportunities where I followed my immediate reaction. I looked at the job responsibilities and I was like, no, see, I want to be the artist booked there for residency, not the one coordinating the residencies.
Yes. Yes. Mm-hmm.
So
100%. And I guess, with the remaining minutes that we have, maybe the both of you could give, since it seems like a lot of people who are with us today are both artists and arts administrators, maybe your like top tips for navigating both at the same time.
Go ahead, Maxine.
I'd say, like, as someone who's usually very clear, maybe it's an Aries trait. I'm very rarely I'm not clear on what I want, and so I find that as long as I stay in alignment with what I'm looking for, I'll find the opportunities that fit within that. So, like when I was a full-time arts administrator, I was committed to that and steadily working along that. And then when I made the transition to where I'm at now, like committing to that, like I have found the opportunities that I really were seeking. So, and continue to be in that position. So just being very clear on what your agenda is in terms of how far you want to go with your artistic practice and how you want to far go with administrative practice, and charging forward with those in mind. And for people, any woman of color who's watching, definitely, and if you're an arts administrator, definitely seeking the resources of women of color in the arts, because they saved my sanity many a time.
I guess the tip I would give would be, it's sort of complementary, I think, to what Maxine is saying, is there are times where it's okay to not know and what it is, and perhaps there is pressure, to be definitive about which path you're taking. But I think it's important to understand that whichever one you choose will enrich the other. And arts administration is nothing without the artists. but also having the experience of in arts administration will really strengthen your artistic practice as well. And so whatever space you're in right now, you've learned a lot, you're learning a lot. And if you're feeling pressure to, move in a certain direction, I think just remember that both of these paths are so intrinsically connected and inform and enrich each other that you're going to be okay. So
100%. Thank you for that. And yeah, I guess on that note, any other parting notes or parting thoughts?
I mean, I just hope everyone's, especially since the times that we're living in are still very uncertain, to really rely on their networks and community and supporting one another and sharing resources and opportunities. I think that I even though we've had to, we had quarantine and things like that, I still felt very connected to my artistic community because of the sharing of resources and information that went on. I mean, that really was always a part of my world, but became more crucial in this particular time. And so I hope people continue to realize that they have a network and community, they're a part of it, they can lean on.
Yes. And I know we've mentioned WOCA a lot. It is a really great space for that, especially right now. We're really putting a lot of work into shifting and to better support our members right now during this really challenging time. So happy to be a space for anyone who identifies that way. So
thank you for that. And yeah, thank you so much for bringing up the idea of community, because that's also another thing that gets overlooked in these discussions, and how important that is, and how important it is for artists to work collaboratively and uplift each other, because we're in this, dog eat dog world, and it's so easy to get wrapped up in that mentality. And so, when we step out of that and find ways to collaborate and build together, it benefits everyone involved. So thanks for reminding us of that, Maxine. Appreciate that. So we're just about at the end of the hour. So I want to thank everyone for attending. And please do stay tuned for more information about our next A Better Conversation event taking place 3 weeks from today. You can follow us on Instagram. Our handle is @ArtsBizCollab, or on Facebook, facebook.com/ArtsBizCollab. And then also, please feel free to reach out to Rising Tides with questions, thoughts, ideas. You can do so at research@artsbusinesscollaborative.org. I'm going to drop all of that into the chat so that you guys have it handy. You can see it clear. And on that note, thank you so much. Have a great evening, everyone.
Nice chatting with you, Maxine.
Likewise, Shayna.